Alright, so in the last drawing we went through and completely annotated, added all of these notes to the typical wall section. And I also went through and made copies of the title blocks and viewports and got all of these different views set up. So right now, and basically I just did that by copying, CP enter. I copied the title block and the viewport, and then I just clicked inside the viewport and panned over until I found the view that I wanted. And then for the typical wall section, I also changed the scale. So the next step is to add a couple more drawings. So whenever I look at model space, I have 2 elevations. We're going to settle with just 2 elevations instead of 4. I have my foundation plan, and which shows my footing and my slab, how it's going to be cut. I have my floor plan with any openings in it. I have my typical wall section, and I also have a building section that cuts across the building that I haven't done anything with so far. So another drawing that I need to do is I need to have a roof plan. So to create my roof plan, there's a couple different ways that I could do that. A lot of times I'll use my typical wall section to create that, but I can also basically just go off of this floor plan and my building section, since it's really simple. So I'm going to copy this, and I'm just going to bring it up here, and I don't need any of this stuff right here. All I really need is that roof. I'll keep the outside walls, get rid of these dimensions. I'm going to erase the whole thing after the fact anyway, so I'm not really worried about it. And on here, I'm going to basically use the outside edge, or the face of the stud line on my roof plan. So whenever I do this, I can start out by going through and deleting everything on the inside. And just leaving this outside edge. I'm going to go ahead and delete these dimensions as well. And I basically want to be left with something that looks like this. And I also want to get rid of all these individual little parts. I'm just going to do a window around those. So now I have these 4 different lines. So I'm going to fill it with the radius of 0. And these represent, again, if I would project the line down, it represents the outside edge of my walls. So I'm going to make another layer, make a-roof-wall. And I'm going to make this color blue, and I'm going to make the line type hidden. So the rule is for a hidden line, or the use of a hidden line is basically whenever I want to show that something is there, but I technically couldn't see it in the view. So since the overhang of the roof is going to be covering up the walls, I wouldn't technically be able to see that whenever I'm looking down at the roof plan, but I do want to show where that is so I can dimension the overhangs and basically show the outline of the building. So this is a pretty simple building that's just rectangular. If I was doing something a lot more complex, then it would be even more important to do so. So I'm going to highlight all these, and I'm going to go to my home screen, and I'm going to change that to that layer I just made, the A-roof. Let's find it, A-roof wall. All right, so the first thing that we need to notice is these hidden lines look really, really small, and the reason for that is the last time I was working on this drawing, the scale was at 1 inch equals a foot for my typical wall section. So my instinct is to go through and change the scale of this to 1/4 inch equals a foot to match the other floor plans. What I'm going to do instead, and whenever I look at how my sheets are laid out, basically what I want to do is I want to have my roof plan live right here, and I want to have my building section live right here. There's really not many annotations or detail that's going to show up on either of them, so I'm going to make those both a smaller scale. So to figure out what scale I actually want to use, I'm going to take this outline. I'm going to change the scale to, right now the other plans are at 1/4, so I'm going to drop them down to 3/16 of an inch equals a foot. And whenever I regenerate the drawing, you can see that these lines change. So the next thing would be this. Whenever I'm in my layout mode, since I have two different scales, I'm going to just slide this viewport over, and then I'm going to copy any viewport. I'm going to click inside of it. I'm going to go find the floor plan I want to use, click outside of it, and I'm going to change this to the scale that I want to try. And I'm going to leave that at 3/16 of an inch equals a foot. I'm going to leave a little bit of extra space there just so that I have enough room to add the roof line, any dimensions or notes. So then I'm going to pick this up and I'm going to bring it down and see how it would fit. So if I really, really wanted to make this work at 3/16, I could probably make it work. But it's going to be really tight and really close. So I think what I'm going to try to do is change this to an 1/8 inch equals a foot scale instead. So the roof is basically half the size of the other plans. And I can see that that is going to fit real easily on there. So then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to copy this, click inside of it, pan by pushing the wheel on my mouse in, and I'm going to find my building section, and this would actually be rotated, so I could do that MV setup, align, rotate, and just rotate at 90 degrees. Do that one more time. Align, rotate 90. And it's not rotated the way that I want it to actually be there, but I could basically bring this down here and see if it's going to work. So it looks like it would actually fit. So for right now, I'm going to go back to my model space, and I'm going to change my scale to an 1/8 inch equals a foot. That way, anytime I add anything, any notes or dimensions to this, they're going to be annotative, and they're going to scale up accordingly. So the next step is to make a layer. Layer, make a dash roof. And I'm going to make that color green, a little bit darker than blue. And I know that my overhang is 12 inches, so if I really wanted to, I could start offsetting this out and then filleting it, just so that we use our orthographic projection so we can see how this would really work out. I'm going to make sure that this plan view is lined up with both this elevation and this building section. So I'm just going to draw these lines, double checking to make sure they're still correct. Looks good. And in this direction, that's lined up. It's lined up with the OSB. It's lined up with the stud wall, the face of the stud. That looks good. So at this point, I could draw a line up from the outside edge of my roof. There. Do the same thing here. Come to the outside edge of my overhang. Both sides. Draw those. Fillet them. So these 4 lines would represent the outside edge of my roof. The last line that I need to put on there would be my ridge line, the line that represents my ridge line, the ridge of my roof, the peak of my roof. So I'm just going to draw it over to there, and then I'm going to trim that off. And that's basically the components of our roof. Just to show you real quickly, if I was going to have a hip roof down here, instead of having a gable end, if I had a hip roof, I'll show you how this would change. So my hip roof would have that same pitch, 512 roof pitch, or I could do something different for the hips. I'm just going, for demonstration purposes, I'll just show the 512. So I'm going to grab one of those lines that represent the 512, and I'm going to bring that to there. And if I was going to slope it up at 512 in both directions, I wouldn't have this part of my roof. From the front view, the roof would look like that. And to find out where those actually occur in the plan view, I would project lines up from there and basically follow all of my lines out. So this line now represents a hip in the roof, and it goes from this point to this point. This point right here represents this point. This point represents that point. So my ridge line would no longer go out to this edge of the roof. It would stop right here. So the first thing I need to do is get rid of the rest of that ridge line. And then I would have my hip line that would go from this corner to that corner. And then on the opposite side, it does the exact same thing. I would have it go out to that edge. And then here, I would do that. Get rid of these, and that would be my roof plan if I was doing a hip roof with a 512 roof pitch. Just to show you one more example, if I decided that I wanted to have this part of the roof sloping at 512, but this part, the two end hips, sloping at 912, I would just simply have a line that represents the 9/12 roof pitch. So I just drew a vertical line 9, horizontal line 12. I would move this into place, and I could fillet this and that. That no longer exists. And then I could mirror it from my midpoint, fillet that. And now that's what the front of the building would look like. And I would just simply project these lines up here. Again, my ridge line is from there to there. In this view, it's from there to there. My hips start where that ridge line ends and goes out to the corners. So it would be from there to there. And from there to there. Whoop. From there to there. So that's basically just showing you some different examples of how you would use different styles of roof, different pitches for the roof, a hip roof compared to a gable roof. Since we don't have any of those, we don't have a hip, these are going to extend the whole way out, and that's basically what our roof plan is going to look like. And I'm not going to use this anymore anyway, so I could basically get rid of this at this point. So now I could go through and do my annotations. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to have an arrowhead that shows, or I want to have a leader that shows the direction of the slope, just to make it perfectly clear which direction this roof is sloping. So they have a roof called a butterfly roof that would basically have things slope from the outside edge to the middle, which makes very little sense at all. But just so that we show that this is a gable roof, we're going to add, I'm just going to go to my multi-leader, and I'm going to draw an arrow, and then I'm going to hit escape to get out of the text. So now I just have an arrowhead here, and I'm going to actually put that on a text layer, A-text, and then I'm just going to copy it over. I'm going to put it in the middle somewhere. I'm going to mirror this one, and then I'm going to find the actual midpoint of that, pick this up and move it from endpoint to perpendicular, erase that line. And actually I could move these out a little bit. I could probably get away with just 2 of these. Just to make that symmetrical, I'll erase that and redo it. So these leaders basically show the direction of slope on this roof. We have the same thing over here, so I'm just going to mirror all these from my midpoint, and this shows that it's sloping from here out to the edge of the roof. The next thing is to show what the overhang is going to be on here. So I could switch my annotate tab, I could do a linear dimension, and I'm just going to come in here to a random spot that dimensions this overhang from the outside edge of the wall to the outside edge of the roof. So I may run into a problem here because I did not choose the outside edge of the OSB. I used the outside edge of the stud instead. So the first thing I need to do is I don't want to put my dimension right here, and my O snap is automatically snapping to this location. So I'm going to hold shift, right click on my mouse, hit R for nearest, or I could come down here and choose nearest, and that gives me a temporary O snap of nearest. I'm going to choose somewhere on that line and then choose perpendicular, and I'm just going to drop that right there. And double check, make sure that's on the correct layer, which it is not. I'm going to go back, I'm going to put that on my dims layer. And it isn't really showing up how I want it to look. So what I can do is I can click on this, and whenever I click on this dimension, I have a grip that's available for my dimension text. And that will give me the ability to pick it up and move it out here to show that. Now if I go into my dimension style, go back to annotate, and look at my dimension style, and modify that, there was an option in here under fit that said text placement. When text is not in the default position, which it will not be in the default position in this case, place it beside the dimension line, over the dimension line with a leader, or over the dimension line without a leader. So if I would have chose this right here beside the dimension line, and I did that dimension again, it's going to automatically put it beside it, and it's going to extend this line out. Now, the other thing that needs to be noted is if I choose that option, I cannot move the text away from the dimension string. It gives me a grip, but whenever I try to move it, it moves the entire dimension. So I have the ultimate, going back into that dimension style, by choosing over dimension line without leader, it gives me the ultimate flexibility as to where and how I want my text to appear. So I always choose that. So the other thing that I kind of wanted to look at in here is having a line in between that text, and I'm going to add that dimension again. I would kind of like to have a line in here, a dimension line in between there. So I'm going to see if there's any options for that. So under lines, there isn't enough room to place both text and errors inside. Either text or errors best fits. When text is not in the default position, place over the dimension line. Let's look at lines real quickly. Doesn't look like I have any options for that. So I did find one option here that under fine tuning on the fit tab in the dimension style, it says draw a dimension line between extension lines. So we could try this. I say OK, close it. This doesn't update automatically. I could try doing a DIM enter update to see if it'll update. Doesn't look like that works any longer. So I'm going to delete that, and I'm going to add this dimension in again. And now I have a line in there, and I can actually move this text also. I'm going to go ahead and leave it where it placed it. So this is how I want this to actually look. So just one more time in my dimension style, text placement over dimension line without leader, and under fine tuning I wanted to check the box that says draw a dim line between extension lines. And that gives me the appearance of this dimension. So that dimension represents the overhang in this direction. The trusses would be running in this direction. So every 2 feet I would have a truss. I could just represent that real quickly by offsetting these lines. So every 2 feet I would have a truss this direction. And what happens out here on this overhang, and these would actually be lined up this very first truss would be lined up on the edge of the wall like that. This out here cannot be a regular truss because, first of all, there's nothing for it to bear its weight on. And second of all, I don't want to see the bottom chord of the truss out here. I want to see an end that looks something like this, with the siding running the whole way up to the underside of the fascia. So this is called a rake. We call this a rake, and it's basically an extension of these trusses, or the top chord of the trusses. So you can put 1 foot block of wood out here on the end of this truss in several locations, and then a 2x, whether it's if you're using a 2x or a 4-inch fascia, then I use a 2x4 to create that rake. If I'm using 2x6, then I'd use a 2x6. But it basically extends out past, and this would be a kind of a weak component because it's all just hanging out there being nailed back into this last truss. So whenever I start laying my sheathing, my 5/8 inch sheathing, it would lap over top of this, giving it some additional strength. So just kind of wanted to point out that this is called the rake. This is just the tail of the truss overhanging here. Both of them are called overhangs. So I want to dimension this rake as 1 foot, and I want to dimension the overhang of the truss, or the tails of the truss, as 1 foot here as well. So I come in here and I add my dimension in this direction as well. And I can just drop it right there. So now I'm showing what the dimension is on each side. And this is basically all I'm going to need for this roof plan. If I had dormers, hips, valleys, I would start calling those out. I could also come through just to clarify things, and I could go to my Annotate tab. I could do a multi-leader, and again, I'm on the wrong layer, and I could call this as ridge, and I could also say provide continuous ridge vent. So we talked about that a little bit whenever we're doing the typical wall section. So as the finish of the roof, we would add a ridge vent, so any air that's coming through the vented soffit is going to be able to escape through this ridge vent, keeping the roof cool. So this text looks really big, and again, that's just to remind you, that's because we're at an 1/8 inch equals a foot scale. So I'm going to move this over a little bit, make it look good. And since it's interfering right there, I'm just basically going to trim these arrows up. See if I can trim them. It won't let me trim them because they're an annotative object. I could explode them and then trim, or I could click on them and drag this in. I would have to do that for all 6 of them, or actually I would have to do that for these 3. And then just so that I have the same appearance on this side, I'm going to erase these, and I'm going to mirror these ones from my midpoint. Change this and these over to my text layer. Nothing shows up here because there's 2 different layers selected right now. I'm going to put these on my A- text. And this basically completes the roof plan. So the next thing that I want to do is, while I was working on that, I noticed that there is something that I would like to add to this drawing. And you can see that my text is all messed up on this, different sizes. So if I change my scale back to this 1 inch equals a foot, this will all look correct again. So I'm going to do that, and I talked earlier about how AutoCAD doesn't handle this real well, and that's kind of what I was talking about. So I think at this point, and it did the same thing with my line type there, so I'm just going to real quickly go over to this view, and you can see that it is correct within my viewport. So I could type in regen all, and it fixes it. I'd kind of like to have a dimension from the tail of my truss to the face of the OSB, or actually I'd probably do the face of the stud because that's where the truss is going to bear on. Just to clarify, so whenever they're building these trusses, so they know exactly how big that tail is, how far it extends out from that bearing point. So I'm going to put it on my A-dim layer, or my dims layer, and I'm going to add go to my annotate tab, add a linear dimension, and I'm going to add this on here, and I'm just going to pull this down right here for now. The only place I can really get it to fit. And that gives a pretty good indication of how long that tail is. So basically it's saying I wanted a 12-inch overhang, so if I have 10 and a half inches for my tail, and I have 1.5 inches for my fascia board, the thickness of my fascia board, and it's going to add up to 12 inches. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just grab this extension line. I don't need it to cover up all of this. I'm going to bring it down to that point right there so that I can see that there's a gap between there to differentiate between my extension line and my wall line. And I don't need to dimension it up here. I'm just dimensioning to the wall. I'm not crazy about how these look, so I'm just going to simply grab these and kind of stretch them out a little bit. And this is the other thing that happens with these whenever I'm working with multiple scales. So now whenever I click on my text, I get all these ghosted images of how big the text could be. I'm basically going to leave it at that. So I'm going to save my drawing real quickly, and the next job that I'm going to do is work on this building section. So I'm going to change it back to my 1/8 inch equals a foot scale, and I'm just going to rotate this view, and I'm just going to move it off to the side. I don't really need to have this lined up with anything. And basically I have everything that I would annotate on this drawing annotated somewhere else, whether it be in the elevation. I show the total height of the wall. I have all the details of the wall section shown in the typical wall section, all those things called out. I have the truss called out in the typical wall section. I could probably add a slope here to that, but I do have that shown in my elevation here. So the whole question is, why do we even have this in the set of drawings? And the answer is, the building inspectors, whenever you look at the checklist for the drawings that they want to see, this is included. So I could go through and I could duplicate all of those different notes calling out different things on here, or I could have had some of those notes on here instead of the other ones. Since this is at an 1/8 inch scale and it's not showing a lot of detail anyways, I'm not going to add any notes to this. I'm basically going to leave it like this, and I'm going to add it to this view right here. And the only problem that I foresee happening is there's a lot of detail here, so whenever I print this out, I may have to come in and start deleting different components because this is at such a small scale, I might not be able to see. These lines might end up blending together and looking really dark. So after I print it, I can start looking at all those details and seeing what I need to delete, or if I just need to simply highlight all of these lines and put them onto a layer, make a separate layer for, we'll just do that real quickly, layer, make a dash building section. And a building section is different than a wall section in that it cuts the entire way across a building. And I'm going to call this layer a dash building section dash lines. And I'm going to make that color 241. And then I'm going to select all of these, making sure they're still by layer, and I'm going to put all of those lines on the same layer, a dash building section lines. And now I know that all these lines that are on here are the thinnest line that I have available to me. So whenever I print this out, if lines start showing up real dark and heavy, then I'm going to have to delete lines. So once again, I'll come over here, clean this one up a little bit, get the viewport within the title block just by grabbing those grips, bring them in a little bit. I'm going to copy this viewport. I know that this viewport is at an 1/8 inch scale. Grab it, move it down here. Click on this. It is. Double check to make sure that's at an 1/8 inch scale. I'm going to zoom in. I'm going to click inside of it, and I'm going to pan. And I'm going to find my building section, and not that one. I'm going to zoom out, zoom in. Once I zoom, I know I need to click on this viewport again, and you see that the scale has changed, so I need to change that back to an 1/8. And then I can adjust this viewport. And then I can just pick this up and move it into place. My O-snap grab there. And this is basically all of the drawings that we're going to do for a very basic construction drawings for a garage plan.